So my name is Flora. My last name is Rutaganira. My government name is Florentine, but I go by Flora. I went to undergraduate. I got my bachelor's in biochemistry and molecular biology at UC Davis. And then I did graduate school, which was in chemical biology to get my PhD at UC San Francisco. And then after that, I did a postdoc, which is what people typically on the academic track to becoming a faculty member in the biological sciences do, which allows them to get some experience running independent projects from the faculty member that they work for. And so I did that at UC Berkeley. And now I'm at Stanford University as a faculty member in biochemistry and developmental biology. And I have a title called assistant professor because I'm new, and that is a pre-tenure role.
And then do you mind explaining a little bit about your research, but in terms that are understandable to a high schooler?
My lab is really interested in understanding what this kind of really open question is in biology, which is how did multicellularity arise? And so we're really interested in understanding how the transition from a single cell working by itself to a multicellular body or cells that are connected as a group working together happened. And this has happened multiple times in evolution. We think that right now it's estimated to have happened at least 20 times, but we're specifically interested in the multicellular development that happened for animals. So animals belong together as one group, and then they had a common ancestor that existed that transitioned from likely this unicellular state to this multicellular state. And then in animals, they're all multicellular, right? So everything from sponges all the way to us all have multiple cells that work together as an organism. And we're really intrigued as to why that happened in evolution for animals and what is it that makes multicellularity important for animal biology. This is an interesting question because when we think about the rest of biodiversity around us, like bacteria, for example, they exist just fine as unicellular organisms. It's still pretty open as to what exactly benefits us being multicellular compared to a unicellular cell state. So that's kind of the big question that we're studying. And to study this, we work on a group of organisms called choanoflagellate. And they're this group of what are called protists. So they're not plants, they're not animals, but they're these, unique group of organisms called choanoflagellates. And they are the closest living relatives to animals. So if you look in evolutionary history, animals and choanoflagellates share a common ancestor. And so we use choanoflagellates to try to understand how this transition to multicellularity may have occurred in animals, because some choanoflagellate species are able to form these multicellular colonies, but unlike animals, those colonies can break apart and the organism still is fine. Animals have to be multicellular, but choanoflagellates can be multicellular. And so we're interested in kind of that transition from can be to must be.
And then how did you get interested in research in the first place?
First, I guess I'll give you some background. My family, my mom was a lab manager at UC Davis. She just retired this year and she worked for a department called plant sciences in the post-harvest department. And what they did was try to figure out how to effectively get fruit crops from the harvesting area to our table. And so that involves a lot of pest management and transportation to keep the fruit, still tasting good while it's in transport to getting onto our tables. And so I learned kind of science early from her from like an agricultural setting. And my dad is mathematician. He teaches math at community colleges in Sacramento. And so I learned about kind of science from both of them first. And so my first kind of jobs in the research area were summer jobs that I did as a high school student working in ag fields. And so that was my first introduction to science. I was working with a researcher that was working on peach almond crops. And so I started to do a little bit of that as an undergrad, but that was mostly as a job on the side. And then I started trying to do some career exploration and research exploration in undergrad. I did some nutrition science work. I did some stuff in biophysics, also some mathematical modeling. But ultimately, I ended up kind of getting really excited about synthetic chemistry. And so I worked in an organic chemistry lab for my junior and senior year. And that kind of oriented me towards thinking about how to use chemistry to understand questions in biology. And so in that lab, we were making molecules that were antibiotics or could potentially be antibiotics. And so I was trying to understand how those molecules worked in the biological system. That got me really excited. And that's what kind of inspired me to go to graduate school in chemical biology, where we were combining making the molecules and then also testing them in the biological system as a graduate student. I
Yeah.
definitely recommend going to a university where they can allow you to do this career exploration. UC Davis was
Yeah.
great, and you just wanted to pay attention to the undergraduate institutions that have undergraduate research as an emphasis. And sometimes you
Okay.
can tell that out by looking for universities that have undergraduate research centers, and maybe they have like symposia, for example, that undergraduates there present at. Those are types of things that you might want to pay attention to. That way, you know that there's like resources at the university that are meant for undergraduates to take advantage of to do research.
Yeah,
They're available
definitely.
at most institutions, but just keep an eye out on them if that's something that you're interested in doing.
Yeah, I definitely will. And thank you for that advice. And then who has been the biggest mentor in your field? And what are like specific traits that you think someone should look for in a mentor to help foster their own growth?
Mentors have had such like an incredible impact on my transition into each of these different research areas and different programs. And so I think sometimes mentors come in at the right time for you at the right place. And that mentor doesn't always have to be the same person throughout, which is why I'm going to give multiple names. And so as an undergraduate, I'd say the big mentors that I had were the mentor that I did my undergraduate research with, Jared Shaw, who's in chemistry at UC Davis. So that's where I did the synthetic organic chemistry work. And he really took the time to help me figure out how to apply to graduate school, how to figure out what I was most interested in. And that was really helpful because my parents, even though they're both in science, they, were immigrants to the United States. I'm actually also an immigrant. I came here when I was 3 years old. And so they didn't really know the like undergraduate kind of ecosystem or graduate ecosystem even. And so having mentors that could help me kind of figure out that process was really important. And so Jared was really great in helping me apply to graduate school and figure out which programs were going to be the ones that I could succeed in. And in order to get into Jared's lab, I didn't even know that like synthetic organic chemistry was something that I would be interested in. And I had actually met with the dean of my college, Ken Burtis, who's now an emeritus faculty member. And he like sat me down and talked to me about all of the really cool research that was happening in new labs that had been recruited to UC
Oh,
Davis.
wow.
And Jared was one of them. Yeah. And so he was like, oh, I can write him an email. And I was like, oh, I didn't like even know you could do that. And now I realize from like the faculty perspective that having a dean write another faculty member is like a really big like favor to give to an undergraduate student.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so he and Jared were really wonderful mentors. I also had other mentors in other research programs as an undergraduate, but I'd say they were probably the two biggest ones as an undergrad. And then moving from graduate school to now, I'd say the two big mentors that I had were the two people that I worked for as a graduate student and as a postdoc. So that was Kayvon Shokat at UCSF, who oriented me towards kinase signaling, which is what we study now in choanoflagellates in my group to understand this transition to multicellularity, because we think there are specific proteins within cells that allow cells to develop this, that allow organisms, to develop this ability to become multicellular, and being able to control signaling effectively is something that we think is important. Kayvon is one of them. And then the other person is Nicole King at UC Berkeley. And she really took this group of organisms, the choanoflagellates, and made them into what they are now in terms of the molecular biology. And so she sequenced the first genome of a choanoflagellate, and really in her lab, they've developed all of the molecular biology tools that we use to figure out how they work. Now we know a lot more about the specific genes that are involved in making choanoflagellates, how special they are. And that has also allowed us to figure out the ancestry question. So we can now compare genes in choanoflagellates to genes in animals and look into see how well they're conserved or not conserved. And then that gives us some information about the ancestry of that gene's function. And that has been really cool. Yeah. And so having both Kayvon from the kinase biochemistry side and Nicole from the choanoflagellate cell biology side, they're my two biggest mentors now as a faculty member. Because I also look up to them because they've had, labs that have been running for a lot longer than mine has been. Mine is only a year, a little bit more than a year now. And both of them have been running labs for at least 10 years. And
Wow.
both of their labs have been really successful. So I look up to them to figure out how to manage and run an effective research lab.
So what do you think is a field that high schooler can develop even without access to a wet lab?
One thing that I really enjoyed getting to do as a high school student was reading about science. And so if you do have access to scientific literature, I think it's always great to look at review articles and just try to get immersed in science as well as you can to figure out what are the big questions people are trying to ask and answer. You don't need to be in a wet lab in order to figure those things out, but you can try to get a sense of like, what are the major questions in biology, and try to see if any of those questions really excite you. Because I think what's really important is to try to start to get a sense for where you find things interesting in science, because science is pretty big. There's a lot of
Yeah.
different things that you could research, a lot of different things that you could do and apply. And so trying to figure out what gets you the most excited is important, but you don't really know what those things are until you start to read them, right? So being able to get access to review articles, maybe scientific magazines, to figure out what interests you, I think is really important. The next thing that I would say is that writing is really important as a scientist, and communicating science is really important. And so even though it doesn't seem, super exciting to like write, small prompts here and there as like, tasked by homework from your English professor, I think, or English teacher, it's really important to try to do the best that you can to communicate things effectively so that other people can understand you. Because as a scientist, that is a really important part of the job, is to be able to explain the science that you did to audiences that are both within your field and outside of your field, kind of like what we're doing right now. So being able to communicate effectively is really important. And so, yeah, I'd say both the reading and then the communication part are two things that I would do and encourage high school students to do. And those are things that you can do outside of a wet lab. Of course, if you can get oriented to a wet lab, that can be exciting too. But without that, I think just being familiar with how science is done
Yeah.
and what type of science is done, I think is also really great.
I definitely agree with you on the communication point. I feel like I've been to quite a few like lectures where you can tell it's geared towards scientists, and like as like the general public, like I don't really understand. And so like I feel like your research isn't as effective if you can't get it out there.
Yeah, and ultimately a lot of our research is public funded too, right? So
Yeah.
it is our job and goal as scientists to make sure that we communicate that work effectively, because it is funded by people that should know what we're doing.
Yeah, and on the topic of writing emails, you were saying that you wrote a lot. I'm sure you get a lot now as faculty. How
Yeah.
do you sort through them? Like, how do you pick out someone out of the crowd?
As you start to interact with faculty more, I think your emails will likely get shorter and shorter, because you'll learn that the more effective emails are the ones that are like written very concisely so that
Yeah.
somebody can get through them quickly. And so I tend to actually do read those more. I remember reading your email and I thought that it got to the point very quickly. And that was really great because I was able to decide very quickly if I could participate in this interview or not. And so, yeah, I think that those are the more effective ones. The really, really long emails are very hard. And honestly, those get sorted into a folder where it's like, if I have time, I can do this later. But oftentimes I don't have enough time to get back to those. So
if you were to hire like a high schooler, like theoretically into your lab, what type of traits are you looking for in someone?
Yeah, so the biggest thing when you're starting out as a scientist is just really especially if you're going to be doing wet lab work, it's really making sure that you have enough time to learn. And so both for high school students and undergrads, what we are expecting is that these are people that would be able to spend a good amount of time. So that's usually around 5 or so hours a day, multiple days a week, in order to get trained. Yeah, because sometimes it really does take that long. And when you're new, it takes you a little bit longer to do things, of course, as you're getting trained. Yeah, the commitment for time is actually a pretty big one. And I find that sometimes can be a hurdle or a challenge for people. But if you're going to do molecular biology, unfortunately, it just takes a lot of times. Especially in the beginning. So yeah, that's what you were usually looking for. Right now, since my lab is pretty new, we don't really have that many openings because I'm spending my time trying to train graduate students and having graduate students work with each other to become more effective mentors. But in the future, we're hoping that we'll have more openings and positions to have high school students and undergraduates join us to do research in the lab. But we want to make sure that we're effective mentors first before we do that, because we don't want to waste other people's time. Yeah.
And like I'm in a wet lab now, and I didn't realize how much time it takes to just get those basic bench skills. I thought I was gonna like walk in and just start doing experiments, but that wasn't the case.
No, it takes a decent amount of time.
Is there any more advice you'd give to high schoolers, like just in general? It doesn't have to like always apply to research.
As a high school student, I went to a college prep high school, and I was really, really, really like nervous about whether I'd get into college and really concerned about a lot of those things. And I think a lot of high school students that are maybe similar kind of try to do a lot of extracurriculars to try to make yourself look really good for college applications. And that's great and wonderful. But I think sometimes when you do do that, you really lose the joy that you should be getting in doing all of those activities. And so I think what I would recommend is, try to sometimes, and this is very hard when you're doing so much, but try to take a step back and really appreciate everything that you're doing because, it is a really unique process in order to get to learn how to be a scientist. And one day you're going to look back on the pipetting that you're doing and remember all of those days, hopefully, where you were doing things that were exciting and new to you. And that's going to ultimately help you as a future scientist stick to doing the science because there's going to be a lot of days where things don't work. And it's really remembering kind of the excitement that you had early on as a scientist and what you're looking towards in the future that will keep you going. And so, yeah, I recommend that as a high school student, take time to enjoy and appreciate all the things that you're doing and how you're learning. It may seem like a lot at the time, but hopefully you are taking time to appreciate things as well.
Thank you so much for your time. That's all the questions I have today. I really enjoyed talking to you.